remember, we talked in the last video about the elements on the periodic table wanting to fill their valence electron orbital. They want to fill that with 8 electrons. So the way they do that is with bonding. And when an element bonds, it will form one of 3 bonds: covalent, ionic, or hydrogen bonds. In this video, I want to talk to you about covalent bonding. Covalent bonds are bonds formed by the sharing of electrons, okay? It is only the valence electrons that will interact with any kind of bond, whether it's a covalent, ionic, or hydrogen bond. Now, covalent bonds are going to be formed with elements that it will take too much energy to give away or to accept electrons. And we'll see that there are some specific groups, particularly the groups with carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. These are going to be the ones that are going to form covalent bonds. There are 2 types of covalent bonds, and I want to talk about both of them. So let's divide our board here. And we have what we call a non-polar covalent bond and a polar covalent bond. Now, non-polar covalent bonds, these are going to share electrons equally, meaning that each atom within the bond is going to have equal access to the electrons. So let's start by looking at an example of a covalent, non-polar covalent bond. So let's look at carbon. Carbon is in row 2, let's come over here so we have a little bit of room, is in row 2, column 4. So we've got our row 2 and our column 4. So let's switch here so we can see our electrons. And so we've got our valence electrons. Column 4 tells us we have 4 valence electrons. Row 2 tells me I've got 2 orbitals, so that first orbital is full. So this right here happens to be carbon. Now carbon would like to have 4 more electrons, but it's going to need to share its electrons. So what it can do is it can share electrons with something like hydrogen. Let's look and see here. Hydrogen is in row 1, column 1, so we go row 1, and then it's in column 1, so it has 1 valence electron. So in order for these 2 to fill their outer orbitals, they're going to want to share. And so what will happen is we can see that hydrogen will share its orbital, or excuse me, its valence electron with carbon. And we can do this 4 times. And here we have a molecule called methane. But you'll see that all 4 of the carbon electrons are paired with a hydrogen. The 4 electrons from each of the hydrogens are paired with the carbons. And you can see that this valence shell now has 8 electrons, and everything is shared equally. I can cut this molecule down the center anyway, and it is completely symmetrical. So this is what we call a non-polar covalent bond. Let's come over here and talk about our polar covalent bonds. Polar covalent bonds are formed when electrons are shared but they are shared unequally. Okay, it's important that you remember that they are shared unequally. When we talk about something being polar, we mean that they have a charge. So what's going to happen is when we have an element that shares its electron unequally, it's going to end up having what we call a partial charge. So a good example of this is water. Let's start here with our oxygen. Oxygen is in row 2, column 6. So that tells me that I have 2 electrons in my first orbital, and column 6 tells me that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I have 2 electrons here that are unpaired. So these are my 2 electrons that are going to interact in my covalent bond. Let's take, for instance, hydrogen. So if we add hydrogen to this, hydrogen is going to come in and share its electrons with this oxygen. But you will see that this is off-center. We see that most of the electrons are owned, if you will, by the oxygen. So they're going to spend more time here around the oxygen than they are the hydrogens. And so this is going to leave these hydrogens with what we call a partial positive charge, and the oxygen here will have a partial negative charge. So this gives water its polar characteristic, even though it's bonded to the 2 hydrogens and the oxygen through a covalent bond. So because these are shared unequally, the elements within the atom or the molecule are going to have a partial charge. We're going to see that in some of our proteins, some of the amino acids are form these nonpolar covalent bonds, and it's what helps to hold those proteins together. This is the first of the different bonds that we are going to talk about here. In the next video, I'm going to talk about ionic bonding and how it can be form bonds in inorganic molecules.